In this video, we are going to talk about human genetic conditions, and we're going to start with showing how you can keep track of human genetic conditions with a tool called a pedigree. A pedigree is basically just a family tree that shows which individuals in a family have the condition that you're studying. Pedigrees traditionally use squares to represent males and circles to represent females. They may use triangles to represent intersex individuals, although that is not shown in this example. When you make a pedigree, you're usually looking at a specific trait, so you fill in the squares or circles of the individuals that have the trait that you are looking at. The pedigree in the example we are about to see is on widow's peaks. So individuals that have a widow's peak have their square or circle colored in the pedigree. There is a line between two individuals that have mated and produced offspring. And the offspring are shown in order from the firstborn on the left, so the oldest on the left, to the youngest on the right. Here is that pedigree. So at the bottom, you can see pictures of two sisters. The one on the left has a widow's peak, which is where there's a little point of hair that comes down at the top of your forehead. The sister on the right does not have a widow's peak. The pedigree shows the members of their family that do and don't have this trait. You can see that both of the sisters' parents have widow's peaks. Their dad's sister, the purple circle on the left, has a widow's peak, but the dad's two brothers, the white squares in the middle, do not. Here's a question for you. Does their mom's sister have a widow's peak? I'll give you a second to pause the video if you want to think about it. The answer is no. The mom's sister, who is the white circle on the right in the middle layer, does not have a widow's peak. Let's look at the grandparents' generation. So on the left-hand side, we can see the dad's parents, and I want you to think about it. Does the dad's father have a widow's peak? The answer is yes. Does the dad's mother have a widow's peak? The answer is no. And how about the mom's parents? So go back to the purple circle, that's the mom, trace up and see where her parents are. They're the white square and the purple circle in the upper right-hand part of the pedigree. Does the mom's dad have a widow's peak? The answer is no, because the box is white. Does the mom's mom have a widow's peak? The answer is yes, because the circle is purple. You can see that the genotypes for each individual are written underneath their squares and circles. This wouldn't always be the case for a pedigree. A lot of the time, we use pedigrees to figure out what the individual's genotypes are. We might start with a pedigree where we just know whether or not the individual has the trait. We wouldn't necessarily know the individual's genotype right away. And then we could use that pedigree to figure out and add in the individual's genotypes later. Notice that this trait is a dominant trait. Here is another pedigree involving these same two sisters. This time we are looking at whether or not the sisters can taste a chemical called PTC. PTC has a bitter taste, and it is present in things like broccoli. So to some people, broccoli tastes particularly bitter, and to others, it might taste less bitter. In the picture, the sisters are tasting strips of paper that have the chemical PTC on them. You can see that the sister on the right can taste PTC. It tastes gross. The sister on the left can't taste PTC, so she's basically just tasting paper. The inability to taste PTC is a recessive trait. So the sister on the left is homozygous recessive for this trait. The sister on the right could be either homozygous dominant or heterozygous for this trait. We actually can't tell just based on the pedigree because both of the girls' parents are heterozygous for the trait, so they could produce either homozygous dominant or heterozygous offspring. Again, you can look at the different individuals in the family tree and determine whether or not they would be able to taste PTC. If we had been given the family tree for the widow's peak or the family tree for the ability to taste PTC, we actually would have been able to figure out if these traits were recessive or dominant without knowing the genotypes of each individual. We're not going to get into that too much for this class, but I just wanted to mention that that is something that pedigrees can be used for. Now let's look at a blank pedigree where we don't know the genotypes yet for a family with polydactyly. You know from a previous video that polydactyly is a dominant trait. That means an individual only needs to inherit one copy of the gene that codes for polydactyly in order to have more than 5 fingers or toes. We can figure out the genotype for each individual in this family tree based on that information and based on the squares and circles that are filled in. We are looking at a gene that can cause polydactyly. Let's call the allele of the gene that causes polydactyly big P and the allele of the gene that does not cause polydactyly little p. Remember that the circles and squares that are not filled in represent individuals that do not have the trait. That means that these individuals have 2 copies of the recessive gene that does not cause polydactyly. In other words, we know that the genotypes of all of these individuals are little p, and we expect these individuals to have 5 fingers on each hand and 5 toes on each foot. From here, filling out the rest of the pedigree is kind of like a logic puzzle. You can pick a place that you want to start. We will start in the upper right circle. That is a female who is polydactyl. Since polydactyly is a dominant trait, that individual could have a big P, or a big P phenotype. Your job is to figure out which of those phenotypes that individual actually has. Sometimes there's enough information in a pedigree to allow you to do this, but sometimes there isn't. In this case, we do have enough information to figure that out. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to, and try to figure out if the grandmother in the upper right-hand corner has a big P genotype or a big P genotype. The answer is that she has a big P genotype, and you can tell because she made a little p offspring. In order for that offspring to get 2 little p's, it had to inherit 1 from each parent. Now let's look at the grandmother's other 2 offspring, the filled in squares in the middle row of the pedigree. These are 2 males with polydactyly. We have the same question. Do these individuals have a big P genotype or a big P genotype? Go ahead and pause if you need to and take a second to figure out what the genotypes of those individuals must be. Both of those individuals must have a big P genotype. We know this because the father of these individuals has a little p genotype, so he has to give a little p to each of his offspring. Finally, we can look at the third row on the bottom there, and it follows the same logic. All of these individuals have the trait, so we need to figure out if they are big P or big P. Go ahead and think about it for a second All three of these individuals must have big P, little p genotypes because, again, they have a parent, the mother, that is little p, so she can only give a little p to each of her offspring. Now that we've looked at how pedigrees are used to keep track of inherited traits in families, let's talk about some examples of inherited human conditions. Many conditions that are genetically inherited in humans are recessive traits. For example, both cystic fibrosis and albinism are recessive genetic disorders. The phenotypes that are caused by these recessive conditions can range from being relatively mild to being life-threatening. Cystic fibrosis, for example, is a lethal condition. In cystic fibrosis, there is a mutation in a chloride transport channel that results ultimately in the buildup of a really thick mucus. This affects a whole bunch of organs in the body, including the lungs. Cystic fibrosis is relatively common. It affects about 1 out of every 2,500 people of European descent that are born in the US. It is less common in other groups of people. In order for an individual to inherit cystic fibrosis, they would need to inherit a copy of the recessive allele from the mother and a copy of the recessive allele from the father. The mother and the father, however, may not have cystic fibrosis. They may be what is referred to as carriers. Carriers are individuals who carry the recessive allele, but they are heterozygous, so they don't have the condition. In fact, these individuals might not even know that they carry the cystic fibrosis causing allele of the gene. For recessive conditions that are rare, it's relatively unlikely that two carriers will randomly meet and have a baby together. About 1 in 30 Americans of European descent is a heterozygous carrier for the cystic fibrosis allele. That means that there is a 1 in 30 times 1 in 30 chance of two of these people coming together randomly. That is a 1 out of 900 chance. The likelihood of two carriers reproducing is increased when there is inbreeding involved. This could mean two members of the same family breeding, or it could mean a group that is genetically isolated from other groups. One of the reasons that taboos against inbreeding exist is because the offspring of these relationships have a higher likelihood of inheriting two copies of a recessive allele that will cause a genetic condition. This can also be a concern in communities where people only have children with other members of their group. For example, in Ashkenazi Jews, there's a relatively high proportion of people with the cystic fibrosis allele. So there is a relatively high proportion of offspring that are homozygous recessive. Another recessive human condition is albinism. You may have heard of people with albinism being referred to as albinos. I believe that this is no longer the politically correct term. It's better to refer to people with albinism as people with albinism. We often use albino to refer to animals, however, so you might see an albino rabbit or an albino mouse. People with albinism do not produce the average amount of the pigment melanin. As a result, they may have light skin, light eyes, and/or light hair. Albinism is generally not a life-threatening condition, but it can lead to problems with vision and an increased likelihood of skin cancer. The two girls in this picture are sisters. The one on the right has albinism. You can see from the Punnett square on the left that both of the parents of these two sisters were heterozygous for the gene that can cause albinism. When these two parents have offspring, each child has a 25% chance of having the albinism phenotype. So, cystic fibrosis and albinism are examples of recessively inherited disorders. There are also human genetic disorders that are caused by dominant alleles. Dominant conditions are less likely to be deadly than recessive conditions. This is related to the ideas of reproductive fitness and evolution. If every individual that has the dominant allele for a deadly disease dies early on in life, none of those individuals will be around to reproduce and pass the dominant deadly allele onto their offspring. Recessive alleles, on the other hand, have the ability to hide in carriers. A deadly recessive allele will only kill individuals that are homozygous for the trait. It won't kill individuals that are heterozygous, meaning carriers. The homozygous recessive individuals might not be able to reproduce, but the carriers can still reproduce and pass on the recessive allele to their offspring. In that way, deadly recessive alleles can survive within a population. Some deadly recessive alleles even give the heterozygous individual a slight advantage. For example, individuals that are heterozygous for the sickle cell gene seem to be less susceptible to malaria. One dominantly inherited genetic condition in humans is achondroplasia. Achondroplasia is a form of dwarfism. The individual on the right has achondroplasia. People with achondroplasia have an average height of about 4 feet, and achondroplasia is characterized by shortened arms and legs. Peter Dinklage, who played Tyrion on Game of Thrones, is another individual with achondroplasia. Because achondroplasia is a dominant trait, only one of the parents must possess the achondroplasia allele. In the Punnett square here, you can see that the father is heterozygous for achondroplasia and the mother is homozygous recessive, meaning she does not have the allele for achondroplasia. Approximately half of the offspring of these two individuals will have the dwarf phenotype. Also, I looked it up. Apparently, it is acceptable to refer to individuals with achondroplasia as having dwarfism or as dwarfs. It is also acceptable to refer to people with achondroplasia as little people or as people of short stature. I talked briefly before about the idea that an individual with a dominant deadly condition or an individual who is homozygous for a deadly recessive condition might not live long enough to reproduce and pass the condition on to their offspring. There are some conditions, however, where the onset of the disease doesn't take place until after the time that the individual was most likely to be reproductively active. Huntington's disease, for example, is a dominant deadly condition that causes degeneration of the nervous system. The disease doesn't have its onset until an individual is about 35 to 45 years old. Until the disease sets in, an individual might not even know that they are carrying the dominant Huntington's disease allele. That individual may have passed the gene on to their children before they even realized that it was a gene that they carried. It is now possible to get genetic counseling for many conditions, including Huntington's disease. When a person goes to a genetic counselor, that genetic counselor will send some of their genetic material off for sequencing. Based on the results of that information, the genetic counselor can help an individual make decisions about their own healthcare and about the possible conditions that might be inherited by any future offspring. Say a 25-year-old with a family history of Huntington's disease was thinking about having children. That individual might go to a genetic counselor to find out if they can expect to experience Huntington's disease later in life. They may also talk to the genetic counselor about options when it comes to having children. Whether or not a person with a genetic condition chooses to have biological children is a very personal choice, and it can often be a really hard one to make. My friend who has the dominant cancer causing allele of the retinoblastoma gene is currently thinking about whether or not he should have kids with his wife. A genetic counselor could help him look at the probability that his offspring will inherit the retinoblastoma cancer. There are also reproductive technologies available now that may allow you to select which sperm or which egg you use for artificial insemination based on whether or not the sperm or the egg contains the detrimental allele of the disease causing gene. Genetic counseling in general seems to be a growing field, so if any of you are interested in it, it's well paying and it might be a good way to go. Finally, many human diseases are multifactorial. That means that both the environment and the genes play a role. For example, cardiovascular disease is influenced by both genetic and environmental components. An individual who is genetically predisposed to cardiovascular disease may be able to reduce their probability of having that issue by having a healthy lifestyle. On the other hand, a person who is not necessarily genetically predisposed for cardiovascular disease may become more likely to have cardiovascular disease if they eat a lot of saturated fats and smoke and don't exercise.